Welcome to Forest Chat, where we talk about individual endeavour in Western Australia, what it takes, what it means, and how you do it. I'm your host, Paul Vandermeer, and in this episode, we're talking with Dr. Patrick Jones about mindfulness-based wellbeing. Dr. Patrick Jones has been in this mindfulness-based wellbeing industry for over 20 years. Welcome to Forest Chat, Dr. Patrick Jones.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yep, good to be here.
Thanks for being on Forest Chat, Patrick. Great to have you here. Patrick, mindfulness-based wellbeing, they're terms that are thrown around quite a lot. Can you give us a better understanding of what that actually means?
Yeah, sure. So I like to make it simple by separating them out into two versions. One I might call event-based wellbeing, and the other I would call inner wellbeing. So today, when we look at mindfulness-based wellbeing, we're talking more about that inner wellbeing place. So when I talk about event-based wellbeing, it's the classical sort of way that psychology relates to the concepts of wellbeing and quality of life. And they say that it's made up of how we think about the world in terms of more positive, constructive thinking, what feelings we have about that, what behaviours we then execute to be able to make sure we have good quality of life, and then the presence of life conditions that support us having that experience of well-being. So basically it's thoughts, feelings, behaviours combined with life conditions. So that's typically what I would say psychology tries to focus on, improving your thoughts, enabling people to have better feelings, and more adaptive or productive behaviours, and more successful life conditions. That's sort of a familiar, recognisable territory for psychology. So that's the quality of life research, which has been where my doctoral work was initially. And then they also then call that subjective well-being, the subject or the person that's experiencing the well-being in relationship to those life conditions. So that's the first lot. We're going to put that under the title or category of event-based well-being. It's in connection to events. Mindfulness well-being is more in that inner well-being country or territory, and that's basically saying the experience of well-being when everything else has gone to pot, when everything else has fallen over. Can I experience well-being that does not come from those life conditions? It comes from an experience of well-being within myself. So that makes it a very robust type of well-being, because life does, as the Buddhists would say, one of the foundational principles in Buddhism would be that all phenomena, all things in life, one of their qualities are that they keep changing. They cannot not. They're always either going up or down. And so well-being that can be sourced from within, inner well-being, is a much more robust place to be able to generate our well-being. So that's why I look more now at mindfulness-based well-being or the inner well-being place, if those two distinctions help.
So when we talk about that mindfulness-based wellbeing and how it is a very strong place for a person to come from, what would a person see in their life when that is working really well?
A nice question. So because they can see anything, their life can be working really well or terribly, and that's independent of their experience of well-being. I had a great opportunity to work once with a share trader, and he was actually teaching people how to trade. And what we worked on was managing the psychological or emotional response when a trade's going really badly and the stock is dropping, and you don't want to make an emotional decision. You want to make a data-driven decision. So in that case, life could be looking in any direction. It could be your shares in life, or your stock is going up or your stock is going down. And you want to be able to hold on to the experience of still feeling okay inside when you're watching this happen. So that's the inner state. But of course, ideally, we want our life to be supportive and our life conditions to be working well. So if someone is managing their mental state well, it makes them more skillful in their life conditions. So you'd want them to be seeing a life that typically works better than someone that's not managing their mental state. However, even if we are super good at all this, we're not fully in control of what life does. So while we might have put in all the right parts to make it work, it still may not. And this is where the inner well-being obviously serves us, because we can still feel okay while we're trying to correct something.
So it's like an understanding that you've got this. Your life isn't being driven by those things that are on the outside. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It is. Where it gets confusing for some people is, well, if I've got this, at least internally, then what's the point of doing anything with my life if I feel good no matter whether life is good or bad? And it's quite a good question, really, because at one level that's true. You experience a sense of peacefulness within yourself. And so then at one level, what does it really matter whether things are going badly or well? Well, funnily enough, I guess the shift is that there is a lot more freedom or independence from how life is going, but things typically are easier or more functional when life is working. And certainly it also means that in terms of contributing to others, when our life is working or we have the relevant skill sets for managing life conditions, it enables us to make a bigger or better difference to people, to others. So in some ways, the motivation for making our life functional and those life conditions working well changes a little bit from I need it to be okay to it helps life run well and it enables me to make a bigger difference.
And that difference, I can see you can make a good difference when you're in a good place. Is that true as well?
Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned a little bit about Buddhism there. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of Buddhism. I actually was brought up as a Christian, and I really haven't looked at other types of religions myself.
Yeah.
What's the impact of a religious perspective on your ability to have strong mindfulness and mindfulness-based wellbeing?
I also have had a little bit of exposure to the different spiritual or religious traditions in my own training. Initially, I did an arts degree in psychology, and then I moved and did a Bachelor of Theology degree. Then I moved back into psychology with a master's and a PhD. And along the way, I guess I examined the different methods that come from the different traditions that can help us. And psychology, what it primarily does, as I said, it works on those thoughts, feelings, sensations level. We're trying to change them so that your life works better, the conditions work better. But typically the spiritual traditions from which mindfulness comes from, in more recent times, has been more clinically applied in psychology, but it does have a Buddhist origin. But the common factor with all these religious or spiritual approaches is that they focus more on methods that try and help people access that inner state, while psychology more works on the mind and life conditions. The spiritual and religious traditions tend to focus on giving people a spiritual experience, you could say, or an experience of happiness that comes from within. So, that's typically the difference between the two of them. I always like to take more of a secular approach, but I would see that if something is true in any religion, then we should be able to explain it with normal language. So what I do like about the Buddhist approach, and the Dalai Lama himself says this, that it's not so much a religion, but as a philosophy. It's a way of thinking. And so Buddhism's foundation really is what they call the Four Noble Truths, which essentially is that life contains suffering, or the aspects of life that we engage with don't have the capacity to keep us happy all the time. Why? Because they're always changing, as I mentioned earlier. So hence life either is unsatisfactory in that you have to keep doing stuff to keep it satisfying you, because it's always changing. That's basically the first noble truth. The second noble truth of those four is that the cause of that suffering that people have is that they cling on to things too much, that I must have this thing, or they have this aversion to other things too much. I must not have that thing happen to me. And the third one they say that makes up the cause of that suffering is a type of ignorance, that if I get those things right, I'll be happy. And at one level, they're correct for a moment, but then those things keep changing. So in a way, it's a lack of understanding about those things, which is why they say that, the cause of suffering is too much attachment and too much aversion and ignorance, that this will do the job. And then basically the third noble truth is that, there is a way out of suffering, and it's essentially not attachment. It's to be able to let go that clinging, if you like, and start to look at maybe where the real source of it might come from, which is, ultimately the greatest compliment actually comes from within me. It's me. It's not those things out there. And then the fourth noble truth is what they call the eightfold path, which is 8 different methods or, techniques or things you should be doing in your life to make sure that your life goes well and you don't suffer. Of one of those 8, mindfulness is one of them, the right concentration, knowing how to concentrate and knowing how to, live ethically, live in a balanced way, all that kind of stuff. Sort of like life skills, if you like. So it's a kind of a methodology all in itself. But what its primary insight is that there is an experience of well-being that you can have within you, beyond everything, or underneath everything, and that it tries to help people get that, which it's a lovely thing to be able to know that potentially that's possible for me when things, especially when life's not going great, and that there might be methods that might be able to help me to do that.
What about from the perspective of you're working in this field? How do you approach that as a field of research?
Certainly in the mindfulness traditions, they would say that a critical component is that the person teaching it is a practitioner themselves. While in psychology, you can do cognitive behavioral therapy, and you should be able to understand it, obviously, and you should be able to, but ultimately you could be an AI agent that's got a great handle on the techniques and knows how to, do an appropriate Q&A for any question that comes up, because you've got the background research and the background to answer any question. Mindfulness pivots a little differently there, and it says your own experience is a critical part of that, because you are meant to, Bandura, there's a fellow talks about social learning theory, that part of the learning is through the modeling, through how the person is demonstrating it themselves and experiencing it themselves. So I would see first that personally to be a practitioner is the first part. And then usually in terms of trying to relay that information, this first step always is to try and help people see the difference between event-based wellbeing and inner wellbeing. And when they can see that, then they develop some interest to go, well, how do I find that inner wellbeing? Because that one sounds a bit more constant. So usually that's the first starting point.
It's pretty natural that people will want the most robust and resilient thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. One thing I guess I can say that's a little bit of a shift for people, and it's probably good to introduce this early, is this notion of what they call in the spiritual traditions awakening. And it's in the line of typically what people might refer also to as enlightenment. And it's very different from trying to be a good person, living a good life, trying to be reasonable, trying to be logical, trying to upskill, basically trying to run your life well. The notion that this one brings is that there is another experience of yourself where that typical sense of me, you have what I call it a natural experience really, but they might call it a spiritual experience, a lot of people, where that sense of self just temporarily disappears. And people might experience that, and suddenly if there's massive hike up a mountain or whatever else, and then they see the view and they just have this aha moment and everything just falls away and they're just like, oh my goodness. And for a moment, life is just, everything is still and silent and very happy, a blissful moment. So that might be those aha moments, and we might even call those awakening moments or even enlightenment moments. And they are a glimpse into what happens when that normal sense of me just temporarily just gets interrupted or falls away. And at that moment, there are no problems. It's just all good. So the mindfulness work is to help people, one, to see that that's possible for them, and then two, to walk the steps to achieve those experiences increasingly, and then to use normal psychology terms to increase those experiences in terms of frequency of them, duration of them, for how long they happen, and then intensity, how deeply they happen, until that eventually they happen more and more until they cross over to the point to where then now that becomes more of where they come from than the old me. And then the final step is that stabilization when, well, that's actually now just my normal way of experiencing myself in the world. And that's the kind of, you could say, the final outcome of mindfulness is that experience and living that way.
You mentioned there you have a course, and that's all about helping people get through that process. Is that?
Yeah, pretty much. Funnily enough, my curiosity and interest started when I first started my doctorate some time ago, and I had this weird question in my head, which was, how can there be a fella, on the other side of the world in the Caribbean on his super yacht, trying to remember whether or not he took his Prozac that day, or his meds to manage his anxiety. And yet on the other side of the world, there might be like a Tibetan monk sitting in the snow in bliss. And it's like, which one? Clearly the first one, that you could say that's quality of life, right? It's got all of those bits in place, and the monk sitting in freezing snow, clearly not quality of life condition. One's managing his anxiety and the other one's managing his bliss. And it was like, how do I put those two together in my head? And it really, really became a curiosity for me. And so that's what kind of drove me to look at, what are the predictors of quality of life and how does it work? And increasingly over time, the research kept coming back to, well, there's these major life conditions that you've got to have right, your relationships, your work, your money, your health, your leisure, you've got to have those in balance. But increasingly the research kept not being able to find that they captured all of the predictors of what made people happy. In fact, some of them even said, like, even we put all those together, they only come up with 5% predictor value. Others up to maybe 10, 15%. So, I rounded them up to say 20%. Well, where's the other 80%? And over time, the research shifted from quality of life to subjective well-being, because it's like, the other 80% is what your mind does with those life conditions. In other words, the mother lode was in the mind, not in the life conditions, which is why the Tibetan monk had the trump card, because he was the one investing in that thing. So, that's what sort of drove me to go, well, if that's the one, then I want to learn more about what that is. And that sort of took me down the path of shifting from quality of life focus to that inner well-being focus. And that's part of that journey, and why that's the one that really needs the most focus out of the two of them. But they both need to be in balance, to have a life that works.
It sounds like it's aligning with the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule.
Yeah, it is a bit like that.
Society seems to drive us into that 20%. Is that because it's more tangible?
Pretty much. It is those quick changes that will give at least the mind, well, if I can just make that situation better, I'm going to feel better right now, which is true. And I think basically, just to come back to your question, what I found in terms of the program that eventually I put together through that doctorate was a mix of, well, now that we know both are relevant, how do we do it? And that the mind is more relevant or has a bigger impact than these life conditions, how do we put that together in a program that represents that? And so in the end, I created what was then called the Mindfulness Based Quality of Life and Wellbeing program, which then simply became Clear Mind, Open Heart. And that was a practical program that looked at teaching mindfulness, the top 10 mindfulness skills, what they are, and what are the exercises that you need to do to practice them, to build that foundation. And I kind of got people to learn that bit first. And then the second part of the program, and 3-part program, was, okay, but let's not forget these quality of life areas, the top 5, relationships, work, money, health, and leisure. There are more, but these are kind of 5 big ones. Again, what does the research say are top 10 predictors in each one of those that you need to be doing, like, for relationships, communication skills, problem solving, empathy, whatever it is. So the second part of the program was teaching people to goal set and use strategies from the research about how to improve those life areas. And then the third one was that Tibetan monk in the snow stuff. It was, and there's this place beyond all of that, that you can awaken to that top of the mountain experience aha moment. What are the methods and processes that we can use to uncover that experience and then start to set up our life to come from that place more and more? And that's sort of really the program. But to me, it highlights, the bigger or deeper principles that to have both working is really balanced life, not just to have the quality of life in place, but to have that inner world working in tandem with it.
What you're talking about with your course really sounds like a key, something that everybody should know, but it sounds like not enough people find.
It always still surprises me. But then, I didn't think about it for a long while myself, just trying to kick those goals. Yeah, isn't it interesting, what gets us to stop and reflect? Sometimes it can be because we have got those goals ticked, but there's still some level of dissatisfaction, or there's some level of ambition or drive but there must be more. I've got to make sure it's, bigger or safer or something or other. So it's interesting, but I think at some point people have to, well, as Socrates said, the unexamined life's not worth living, have to stop and reflect and go, well, is this it? Or what about who am I in this? I got quite practical with that program in the end. So I created not just the program, we ran it through, government grants and research and, for the community and through COVID and, this 3-part program over 6 weeks. But the last version I've done is put it into a 30-day book program. So people do the Clear Mind Open Heart book, and they do one introduction with an introduction exercise each day. And so it's like a slow drip to get that information accessible. And it's really practical, hands-on stuff. So yeah, that's one way that people can make use of the material and take it into their own life in some way.
Sounds fantastic. While you're talking about this, my mind is going to drive a society that is in a better place. From what age up would people need to be considering this type of thing? Yeah.
Interesting. If I look at some of the traditions and what they do, they start off with, and this probably maps some of Piaget and Kohlberg's research on development and in children, that children have a cognitive capacity only for certain amounts at certain ages, and so you have to sort of map that appropriately. So for example, in the early stages, a young child can't quite distinguish between whether they've dropped the glass and it broke, or they're angry and they smashed the glass and it broke. They feel just as guilty in both because the glass broke. They don't have the cognitive capacity yet to make these subtle distinctions in terms of blame and intention and so on. So you have to relate to the child at that level. And then as their brain grows and they get through different developmental stages, Piaget and others have found that they have greater capacity to understand things more, and therefore you can give them more. So in view of that, I would probably think grounding in the basic principles of life skills would be the first place to be starting. There's ethical frameworks in terms of care for others and responsibility and being reasonable and communicating and being transparent and all these really good, wholesome ways of being stuff first as that grows. And then over time, when there is that greater complexity to be able to self-inquire, which would probably come closer into that adolescence onwards time. One of the great questions that they use in some of the Hindu traditions, because I said I've done a fair amount of training with different traditions, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist mainly, but certainly reading and research in other traditions. One of the lovely methods that you can bring in at that more inquiry stage is literally what they call the self-inquiry method. And it goes like this. It's very simple. It's just you ask, who am I? And then you're meant to respond to that question. And you go, well, I don't know, I'm a dad or something. And the response has to be then not that. Why? Well, two reasons. One, because you might be a dad or a mum, but it's not just all you are. It is definitely a quality or a component or attribute. And if your answer is that it's an attribute, or it's a role, or it's a quality of you in some way, some aspect, then we negate it. So you go, who am I? And you go, I'm a dad. And the response is not that. Who am I? And you go, okay, so I'll go a bit deeper. I'm a soul. Okay, I'm gonna beat this method, get there quickly. Okay, well, and the answer to that one is not that. Why? Well, because that's also a concept. Look, you might be true somewhere, but do you also have a body? Yes, we'll see. Not just a soul, are you? So anyway, the point is, who am I? You answer it. Whatever you come up with, you negate, not that, and then respond again with, who am I? Answer, not that. And you can do that 10 times, 20 times, 30 times until the mind starts to slow down in its response. And there's this silence. It's like, oh, God, what else am I going to come up with? Who am I? And the mind's temporarily silent. It's looking, hasn't found anything yet. And at that point, the method's done its job until the mind starts up again. I found one. Okay. And where this goes is eventually this self-inquiry method can get to the point where you're genuinely looking, where is this sense of me? Where is this? What is this? And it can get to a point to where you're looking and you're looking and you're looking in silence, into silence, because the mind's not coming up with anything. And it's like the method essentially goes, well, that's it. Who am I? And basically, to cut the long story short, the answer is that essentially you would say that you're this awareness that's seen, and it's acting through your body and through your mind. Anyway, it's a great technique. And I think at that point, when a child is at a level where they can ask and inquire, this could be a chance to start looking at, are you more than just, as that other research would say, the number one predictor of self-esteem is social comparison. How am I against my mates in sport or my friends in maths or science? In other words, wherever we have our loading very strongly, in terms of other people, that's often what determines self-esteem. So these kinds of methods are quite good for that, because it's like, well, who am I? Well, I'm a lousy runner. Not that. And you keep going.
Well, that's a fascinating way to actually look at it. One of my other guests, their comment about comparison was that comparison is the thief of joy.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, if you're top of the heap, it's not, but life doesn't keep you there for long usually.
As you well know, and you've spoken about, everything changes.
That's exactly, yeah.
So, Patrick, what does it mean to you, your family, or the community that you're able to be working with mindfulness-based wellbeing?
Well, I think the primary bit that is, I feel, one of my contribution points in terms of the community is to open out the conversation about mental health, to kick bigger goals than coping and resilience, which of course at a very introductory level are critical and incredibly important. But once we've achieved that, and often that might be a bit like a hospital, you've got emergency department, then you've got general hospital, but then you've got, wellness clinics. And I would see that a lot of the mental health conversation is around that, almost that emergency department or hospital level, that trying to help people who are suffering, which is a critical part of the sequence, but it shouldn't be the whole conversation. And I think what we're looking at now, which is, awakening to the true nature of a human being that is, can be at peace and at rest just in themselves, should be part of that mental health conversation. And so that's one of the areas I feel, because I've had a background in clinical psychology, but also theology and now research in terms of the predictors of these spiritual or awakening experiences, or the psychology of enlightenment, if you like, is some of my research areas. I think the mental health conversation and also the psychologists. I mean, I run also a psychology company with a number of psychologists, and I think the opportunity is when people come to get help that they are obviously compassionately worked with to reduce their symptoms and increase their functioning. But then the psychologists or the counsellors or whoever's working with people's mental health could also have a bigger paradigm, which is that, who you are is also beyond all of this. And if the practitioner has done the work to experience that themselves, then they might have some language and methodologies to be able to assist someone to encounter that for themselves, which then has a profound impact upon mental health. So I think that's really one of my points, along with trying to bring together a bit more in the research the paradigms of psychology and the spiritual traditions, but in a mainstream way, because I would say that if it's the natural functioning of a human being to experience these ways of being, then we should be able to find the mainstream secular language to be able to explain that. So there are a few of my intersection points with the community and what I can bring to that.
I worked with the state government for 19 odd years, and one of the things that I noted later in my time with them, I'm not there anymore, but what I noticed was that it seems almost suddenly there's an explosion of mental health interventions, I'll call them. And to me, it felt like they had the whole process upside down. And what you've been talking about today, for me, puts the process the right way up from the perspective of the individuals need to know how to make it work for themselves. And when they're able to do that, then the potential that they fall into that emergency department mental health intervention, it's less likely that they'll get to that point. Would that be a reasonably fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, for sure. It's a really has a lot of sort of preventative implications or consequences. When someone can be in touch with this intangible experience of just feeling completely okay, completely just there's nothing there when they look inside that's moving or that's problematic. It's a very peaceful way of being. And interestingly enough, once I was working with she was a very, very devout Christian, and she came when she was working with a trauma, quite a significant trauma. And this is back in the day, and what I did was asked her to bring the memory of that trauma into her connection to her spiritual states, which she'd previously kept separate. And so in a session, we worked in guiding to bring them together. And when she was in that deep prayerful state, which was genuine for her, and then I invited her to bring that trauma in, the potency of her inner experience was so strong that when she brought in all those memories and images, they just weren't there. They came and they just stopped. They just dissolved, or I could say burnt away, or they disappeared in that space. And it's partly because she never really made them speak to each other, and also because when you do sit in this deeper place, it's very intangible, and it's nothing kind of tangible can touch it. And perhaps that's what happened. She brought something tangibly that was very painful into that place, and it just couldn't survive it. So I think there's a lot of power that we have as a being, and the kind of unfortunate thing is that the access to that isn't taught. But it's also not taught because a lot of the practitioners and people generally haven't encountered that or uncovered that themselves, which is why in mindfulness they say, the primary work first is that you are a practitioner, so that you are experiencing this, and then you can develop more clear methodologies that can assist people to also experience that.
It harks back a little bit to the question I asked earlier about, when can people take this on, sort of at what age? And it's almost like society has driven away from all this capability and pushed us down, I'll call it the 20% line. We're just chasing the jobs and the money and that sort of thing. And we're not aware and not been told about, or no one's identified that there's another avenue that we really need to include in our life, and that's like 80% of making it happen well.
Yeah.
So it seems that society, the way that we focus, drives us down the wrong path almost intuitively, and there's no connections, or the connections are very sparse to get back onto a good track.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's simply a matter of, if people haven't experienced it, then it's hard to lead other people to that. And if you're in a teaching position or something or other, I think there is something also slightly, whatever the word is, nefarious or not evil, but a certain capitalism that also is less interested in, when kind of greed does take over. It's a little bit like junk food is easier to eat than nutritious food. And so then appealing to people's tendency to just go with what's easy, tasty and bad for you, that is a tendency. There's a lovely line, I haven't remembered it for a while. St. Thomas Aquinas, a paraphrase of something this great theologian said, was that man is essentially good, but with a tendency to evil. I thought it was sort of like it's the quality is sort of quite realistic there. So I think we have this, but we also have these tendencies to go their easy and unhealthy route. And so we do need people out in the community and leadership and training and so on to really lead the way in these areas, on many levels of marketing, advertising, government policy, a range of things that address what ultimately is good for humans. And also, if you look at, there's a lot of, done a lot of research on, say, for example, the correlation between hospital admissions and mental health. And, if someone experiences anxiety, they have a much higher, not necessarily each person, but as a general trend, they'll have a higher hospital admission rate on other topics that are not connected to anxiety. And so, for example, if we focused a little bit more on this inner well-being place, it has a huge impact upon so many areas, just that one hospital admissions, which of course has a massive impact upon fiscal policy in terms of budgets and available finances for other, well-being things that can then help people be happier overall. So I think this topic has lots of other implications. I tend to focus more on the means and methodologies for people to experience this way of being beyond all of it. But I very realistically see its relevance across many other more commercially oriented topics.
Yes, it sounds a little to me like the homelessness situation. You can't point your finger at one thing and say that's the answer. There's a raft of different things, and every person in that situation has some variation on their journey to homelessness. And this is similar in a lot of ways. There's a lot of interacting factors that actually create the scenario where departments need to put in mental health programs as effectively emergency interventions.
Yep, and that to upgrade their definition of mental health to focus a lot more on, once you're out of crisis, how do we build that robust way of being so that you come back here less often for your sake as much as the organisations, of course.
Absolutely. Organisations are people. They really need to understand that they are people and a group of people. And, the fact that there's like an ABN number, it's a construct, an economic construct, and not a real being, if you know what I mean. Patrick, if you had something to say about mindfulness-based wellbeing, what would you want to tell an audience?
Primarily that there are much greater and deeper experiences of yourself or oneself that are possible outside the typical event-based approach to life, and that there's a chance that people can find methods that can assist them to go within, that there's an experience that's just what I might call beyond form, that is so different from our normal concepts of mental health and well-being that we may not have encountered it before, but it is what I would call our birthright, our true nature. And I guess that's what I'm primarily focusing on bringing into greater awareness, that this way of experiencing ourselves, should ultimately be everyone's opportunity to experience. Yeah.
That gives people much hope.
And one of the ways in terms of what things that I do in terms of how people can access this, if that's relevant, obviously at my website, drpatrickjones.com. In that they can see some of the materials that I've looked at. We've got sort of a range of free research that's there. One of the academic books I've edited, The Happiness and the Psychology of Enlightenment, had like 10 or so researchers from around the world all discussing different topics in terms of this particular interface. And the free links to that book are on the website. And if people want to access also the book, Clear Mind, Open Heart, which is that 30-day program, there's ways to buy that on the website. And of course, just the opportunity for either mentoring or ongoing speaking in different places that happen along the way. There's a few options if people want to access that material a bit more.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And what is next for you, Patrick?
Oh, yeah, I'm literally editing right at the last stages of my third book. It's called Enlightenment Psychology, and it's in two parts, looking at both the journey, the spiritual or the psycho-spiritual journey, you could say, to that inner well-being place is the first part of it. And then second bit is lots of Q&As with students over the years in terms of their experiences with that. It's been a fantastic experience to write this one, and heading off to the publishers soon.
Oh, we'll look forward to that. We'll have to update the description on the podcast with a link when that one's available.
Yeah, that was good.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for being on Forest.chat. And all Forest.chat listeners wish you the best with your future endeavours.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to say a bit more about some of these really important topics.
A pleasure. You've been listening to Forest.chat, where we talk about individual endeavour in Western Australia, what it takes, what it means, and how you do it. I'm your host, Paul Vandermeer, and in today's episode, we've been talking with Dr. Patrick Jones about mindfulness based wellbeing. Remember, there are 4 ways to get involved with Forest.chat. Share the domain Forest.chat with your friends and family and people you meet. When you sign up for emails, you get advance notice of episodes. Listen to the episodes at forest.chat/episodes. If you do something interesting, or someone you know does something interesting, book an interview at forest.chat/interview. If you want to support a small business, book an advert at forest.chat/advert. I'm looking forward to joining you with our next guest. Until then, enjoy making it happen.